I'm Jeanette Pincus, and today is Tuesday, April 2nd, 2024, and I have the honor of getting to interview Richard Berry for him to tell us his story. And I'd like to begin with, Richard, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For doing this. I'd like to start with if you could tell me about your family, background, history, parents, grandparents, anything you'd like to share.
Wow, where to begin? Okay, so I've actually traced a bit about how all of my branches of my family ended up in Dallas from Ukraine, from Russia, from Lithuania most recently, from Romania, all the different branches and how they ended up in Texas and then particularly in Dallas. I guess on my mother's side, there are Katzes and Goodmans. I mean, the Goodman family, I think, is pretty well known here in Dallas. I'm part of that. My great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, I think it was, and I'm not even sure of pronouncing, Zessie and Shushi Goodman, who I think is common with Bobby and many others, came here, I believe, through Galveston. And there's a picture that we have in common from the 1920s with this massive family that's assembled on South Akron Street in front of a home there. My Zadie Katz came through from Lithuania. He was the last to come. He came through Mexico and into Laredo, and then came up and grabbed my grandmother. They knew someone in common from the old country. My Zadie Katz, Abe Katz, was 30-ish, and my grandmother was 18. And he came up, and they went on this date. And the story is that she looked out the window and saw this little short guy coming up, and was like, "Oh my God, I can't do that." And 3 weeks later, they were married. And before he passed away, they'd been married 60 years. But he came from Lithuania through Mexico into here. And I guess on the other side, the Berries, they came from the Belarus area met in the Carolinas, changed the name from something like Bergine to Berry, and most of them stayed in the East. And I had a really large family reunion in the early 1990s where I saw these people that, some of which looked amazingly like me that I didn't know existed. But the one that is my great-grandfather came across to Oklahoma, set up a dry goods store, as so many of our family members did, and then had family there, and then my grandfather ended up coming into Texas.
So in Oklahoma, do you know what community that was?
Yes, and I knew you would ask me, and it was around 1904, 1905, and I actually had...
Oh, that's almost like Indian territory still.
Right.
Yes.
It was right at the very beginning of that.
Uh-huh.
And
so it hadn't been established as state, almost.
It was right at about that time.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I'm drawing a blank right now at the time. And I actually had the book in my hand this morning, and I was going to bring it, but I did not. Yes, they came.
And then they moved out of Oklahoma.
Well,
yeah.
My great-grandfather, I guess, he ended up getting in an accident, and my grandfather's brother is the one that ended up helping to run this pipe business that my great-grandfather had morphed into by whatever, the ping pong ball of life. And most of them, I think, pretty much stayed in Oklahoma for a long time. My grandfather and his brothers all went to OU. The brothers were state-ranked wrestlers at OU in the program there.
So Richard, was the name of the pipe company? What do you know the name?
I do not know the name of the pipe company.
But it was the Berry family.
Right. Well, and I actually have a family history that we had a Berry cousin, William Berry, who lived in D.C., he was an attorney. He actually went over to the community in the Belarus area and went through libraries, and he put together a family history and has fold-out sheets for each one of the brothers. And he actually got a copy to each of the people that he knew about at that time. And then I went and grabbed a bunch from my family, including my cousins, Barbara Levy, who was Barbara Berry, cousins and her kids, and had them bound at a place in Deep Ellum, so that we have this nice history book. But
That's wonderful. So you
But he actually wrote, I'm sorry,
That's okay.
I digress. My grandfather Barry actually wrote the foreword. He wrote a very detailed letter about the history of the family and the stories he'd heard from my great-grandfather, and what transpired in his life, that he got in a car accident, and then that his brother Aaron took over the business and all of that sort of thing with the pipe. And
so when you were telling me, I know I interrupted you at that time, who went to OU? Which generation? Your grandfather?
My grandfather, Jack Berry, and his brothers, one was Aaron, and the others. But and I actually have an old, I'm the one that collects all the books. I've got an old annual from OU that's got pictures of them in there from their time at Oklahoma. But, and then there's the Hefflers, my grandmothers on my father's side. Henry Heffler came through, I believe, Galveston, the late 1890s, maybe early 1900s. He went to Tyler, and he ended up being one of the founders of the Orthodox synagogue there. And then he had a dry goods store there, and the building still exists. And a cousin actually, who was something of a developer, whatever, purchased it, and he's actually refurbished it. It's the Heffler building. And but that great-grandfather somebody came in to rob the store in the 1920s. He came downstairs when his wife yelled out, and he reached for a gun, and he was shot and killed in his store. That great-grandfather, Henry Heffler. And so because of that, I think one of the Jewish organizations in Tyler was subsequently named for him in his honor. And there's a lot of, including my father and my son's middle name, there's a lot of Henrys in our family. I think Lauren Levy, they have a son, Henry. Maybe it's Jay. You may know better than I do, but there are a lot of Henrys in our family in honor of him, and he was shot and killed in 1922. So, and I guess on my mother, again on the Goodman side, also on my grandmother's side, her last name was Todes, Todes. And my great-grandmother there was Sarah Todes Goodman. Sarah is in the book that the Dallas Jewish Historical Society put together with oral histories, and she's in the book, Mama Goodman. She ran the kitchens at Shearith Israel for a while. But her mother, Rose, was in St. Louis. I think she came with her husband through New York, and in my great-grandmother's interview, she said that her husband passed away, or that her mother's husband, her father, passed away, but I think I know, and from research with other cousins, that he didn't pass away, that he left. And there was a gentleman in Dallas who was a widower, who'd been in Russia and Europe and had been married. His name was Jake Tobolowsky. And somehow Jake Tobolowsky found that my great-great-grandmother was in St. Louis and no husband and had some kids, and brought her to Dallas in like 1904 or 1905. And he was an older widower, and I don't know that they were ever married. They're not buried together. Down at the Shearith Israel Dolphin Road Cemetery, I know where the plot is where Rose is buried, my great-great-grandmother there. I actually found where Jake is. They're not together, but he passed away just a couple of years later in 1907. But my great-grandmother Sarah Goodman, in her oral history, actually mentions Jake, pretty much being the only father she ever knew and what a nice man he was, and but that he passed away pretty early in 1907. So, sorry if I'm a little scattered, but that's kind of how all these branches
I love
ended
how
up
you
here.
know so much of connecting everyone together. There's a lot of families that you're explaining a lot of relation to.
Yes, it's a little scattered in there, but I'm trying.
So, but you were brought up where?
In Corpus Christi.
Yeah. So how did you end up there?
Okay, so again, my grandfather ate cats who came through Mexico because of the immigration quotas in the 20s, who came into the United States through Laredo, and I actually have papers where he crossed in Laredo. He ended up staying and working in South Texas, and again, heard about my grandmother, Doris Goodman, who was living here in Dallas, and came up and met her and drug her back down to South Texas, and they settled in Corpus Christi. Every time my grandmother got pregnant, and they have 3 daughters, my mother and my 2 aunts, she wanted to be with her mother to have her kids, so my mother and both of my aunts were born in Dallas, but then she would go back to Corpus Christi and where they lived down there. And but so my mother also stayed in Corpus Christi, married my father very young, Henry Berry, very young, at 17, had my daughter at 18, my sister Toby, who lives in Houston, at 18, and my brother Randy at 21, and me at 24, and then I think when I was 8 or 9 years old, my parents divorced, and so I stayed and lived with my mother there in Corpus Christi, and I didn't come to Dallas until, I knew I had family here. We came up for events, obviously, weddings, other simchas, but I moved to Dallas kind of at a flip of a coin after college, as a better place to find work than Corpus Christi. I lived in Houston one summer and worked there, and Houston, nice city, but hot and humid, and being from Corpus Christi, I knew I kind of wanted to get away from that, so I came here after college.
Question, I'm feeling like Corpus, to me, is a small town. What was it like growing up being a Jewish boy there? Was it a small community there too?
Relatively small, but surprising to most people. There was a temple there going way back. And then with the influx of some of the Eastern European Jews, like my grandfather Abe Katz, and another prominent gentleman, Sam Kane, who had a really large meat company, in 1943, they broke away because they wanted something more traditional than the Reform Synagogue, and they started B'nai Israel Synagogue in Corpus Christi, and first in a home, and then they built a building, and then that my Zadie Abe Katz was, one of the founding members. He was a president of the congregation for a while, but I was actually raised in what I would call a fairly traditional conservative synagogue, and growing up, went to Hebrew school, Sunday school, was bar mitzvahed there, and then subsequent to my bar mitzvah, I really enjoyed lots of times getting called by my grandfather, and say, Richard, come, we go to Shabbat services. You can daven Musaf, and the cantor there, Bernard Kane, who also taught me my bar mitzvah, was a wonderful guy and a good teacher, and yeah, they would always pull me up there, this young guy, and I'd be there with all the older gentlemen who would be there for Tel Make Minion, and I would daven Musaf, and they'd go in the back room, and they'd have a little schnapps, and occasionally they'd give the kids some, but I really didn't like it much back then. But I'd like to think that it would, the Jewish upbringing there was a little more traditional than what one would expect for Corpus Christi.
Yeah, that sounds nice. What was social life like there for you?
Well, I was a little bit of an outcast. I hung with a little bit of a different group there growing up, and I since have actually kind of gone back to some of them. I recently went to a funeral here for a gentleman named Leon Lampert, whose daughter Ellen I went to school with. Ellen was there, and she reminded me. She said, "Yeah, you were a little out there in high school," because I didn't hang out with them. I'd gone all through Hebrew school and Sunday school with her and some of the others, but she was relieved to see that I turned out. And I remember my grandmother, Doris Goodman Katz, who was the ones that I was closest with there in Corpus Christi. She would always, there was always this uncertainty about Elaine because she did convert, and then they obviously fell in love with her because of how of her committedness and how wonderful she is. But she would always look up at Elaine every time we were together, and she'd say, "Oh, you really saved this boy." But my social life, I hung out with guys and went to the beach, and as a young child, I did go to Camp Young Judea. I enjoyed going to Camp Young Judea in Wimberley for a number of years. Looking and seeing in some of the old pictures from 72 or 73 where there are people from Dallas who I now know who were there at the same time with me. I know Cindy Moskowitz, a year younger than me, I think. She was in at least one of the pictures that I have from back then, and I always enjoyed that.
So they're like your Sunday school classes, they were like, how many would you say were in your class?
Oh, 10 to 15.
Okay.
Yeah, relatively small.
So did you feel like there was any anti-Semitism when you were growing up? Did you notice it at all?
Not really, not in Corpus Christi that I can recall, and when I got a little older and I went to college, certainly there were more signs of it there, but not really growing up in Corpus Christi.
Where'd you go to college?
Well, I started off, I wanted to be as far away from home as possible, but I didn't want to subject my parents who were doing this for me to paying out-of-state tuition, and I'd gotten accepted to University of Colorado, whatever, and I ended up going to Texas Tech to start off. And while I was at Texas Tech, with the help, a little bit of financial help from my Zadie, Abe Katz, got together with a small group of other Jewish guys, and we tried to start something of a Hillel there. I mean, the Jewish population of Texas Tech at that time was very small, and I don't think they would actually be allowed to do it at this day and age, but they actually gave us lists of the people who had signed up and claimed to be Jewish. As memory, I think in the forms there were 75 people who had claimed to be Jewish, but then when they were actually called, and maybe they were so shocked at actually being called to help set something up, there were maybe half of that who actually agreed to it at that time that they were, and even a smaller number that we could get to meet occasionally, so it really didn't last very long.
Did you mention a year, around what years that was, that you were trying to set up Hillel?
Well, I started at Texas Tech in the fall of 78, okay. So probably 79. Okay. I also had some friends from Corpus Christi there, which is another reason I thought I wanted to be there. No offense, Lubbock, but Lubbock's not a great place. So in the summer after my second year, in the spring of '80, I guess I'd given my mother the inclination that I was not all that happy at Texas Tech, and I was finding myself. I didn't know where I'd been happy anywhere, but she transferred me to the University of Texas. And so next thing I know, I'm transferred, and I did my last 3 years of my 5-year college degree in Austin, which was a much better fit, much more fun. Stayed in Madison House, which I guess was on 21st Street. And here I was here as a junior. There was another Dallas guy named Scott Friedman, who was also at Texas Tech, who, unbeknownst to me, had transferred to Austin at the same time I did. And we walked into Madison House and saw each other and like, wow. So, Austin, as you know, because you went there as well, was a much better experience all around. I was approached by fraternities. I had a lot of fun that first year that I was there as a junior with fraternities, but I did not pledge a fraternity, so I stayed a little bit away from that crowd. So.
Did you go to the Hillel there?
Not often.
Like for the high holidays?
Well, I would always go home for holidays.
Okay.
I mean, when I was at Texas Tech, at that time, my grandfather's company, with another company, actually had a private prop jet. And he actually flew up, had his guy fly up to Lubbock a couple of times and pick a couple of us up, and then go to Houston and pick up a couple of aunts and go to Corpus, and we would do that. So, but when I was in Austin, always for high holidays and for Pesach, I would go home to Corpus Christi.
Okay. Let's see. You mentioned after college you decided to move to Dallas.
Yes.
That's okay. So let's start there. What kind of work were you doing when you first got here? Who'd you like? What area of town did you move to? How was it when you got here?
Okay, so I came up here in 1983 after I graduated. Didn't have a job. I lived with my great aunt and uncle, Florence and Sidney Smiley, who lived on Brookshire, just up from St. Mark's. Is that correct? Yeah, they were down almost at the cul-de-sac, all that end of it. And it was very nice of them to house me, and it was very interesting living with them for 8 or 9 months. And I interviewed with a number of companies to do things. I had really poor grades in college. I was not a good student. And had banks laugh at me, and interviewed with a chemical company, and I ended up going into real estate. My mother was and has always been in real estate, had an aunt in real estate. So I ended up going and getting a real estate license and going into commercial real estate, and I started work with a company called Hoyt Matisse that was in an office off of Central and originally off of Meadow, and then subsequently in a black glass office building off of Forest. And went through training and trudged away at putting hours in there to try to build some clientele and build some business. And interestingly enough, because my family still had my great-grandparents' lot from where their house was at 1709 South Ackerd Street in the Cedars area, that was my first listing and my first sale, was to sell this lot, which is still vacant, by the way, after all these years, on South Ackerd Street that had belonged, was where my great-grandparents had their home, going back to, I think, about the They were married in 1915, I think about 1920. Because I think they still lived up on Caroline Street, north of downtown, where the rest of the family lived, before they built the house and went to South Ackerd Street. But because of that, you know, back in that day, they wanted you to have an area that you worked. And I worked the Cedars area. And so I have maps and files somewhere where I knew every entity that owned every single lot in the Cedars and had communications with, you know, obviously descendants of a lot of the original Jewish families that lived there. I even went down and actually, there's a company there now, and I took them. I have like a map that showed all of the lots and all of the listings I have, and you know how the city park, old city park, was expanding, and I had all my listings and all the marketing information on the back of that map, and I took this coffee place that's on South Ackerd Street a copy, and so they could pin it on the wall just as some of the history of the area. It broke my heart because, you know, we can go into Elaine later, but you know, I met Elaine in the course of all of this in 1984, and our first date was in what was then the refurbished Ambassador Park Hotel there in Old City Park, which unfortunately now burned down just a few years ago. And it was caught up in all the real estate condo stuff with the Faulkners and the Tollers of the early 1980s, but they had redeveloped the Ambassador Park Hotel into a beautiful place, beautiful restaurant with leaded glass and dark wood, and really a shame that it burned down. But yeah, I spent a lot of time down in the Cedars area because of that initial tie-in with my family to that lot on South Ackerd Street.
That's great. So you mentioned you met Elaine. Y'all got married.
Right. Yeah, Elaine and I remember very clearly. I went out. I wasn't dating anybody. I went out for a drink and dinner with a Dallas guy named Gary Bergman, his family in the produce business, which has a tie-in to my grandfather Abe Katz, who, you know, coming across the border from Mexico with nothing, built a very large company called Valley Onions. And he had tie-ins with the Bergmans and with the Rutchick family here through produce. But I went out to dinner with Gary Bergman. I remember we went to Ruth Chris on Greenville Avenue, and then we went up for a drink to what was then called the Cirrus Lounge, which was a jazz club on top of the Doubletree Hotel, the Gold Tower there at, I guess, at Northwest Highway. And we're there for a drink. And there, Elaine asked me to dance, and I said yes. And you know, it took me a month later to ask her out to dance. Now, what I didn't know at the time is I'd gotten up to go use the restroom, and Elaine had come and asked Gary to dance, and Gary had said no. And then I came back, and she came over and asked me to dance, and I said yes. I didn't realize I'd been the second choice that night. In you know, chatting with Elaine that night, I found out that her boss was a gentleman named Eamon Deneur. And I don't know if you know Eamon, had a wife Polly. They lived at Royal and Inwood. And Eamon is, and I think both of them may have since passed away. Eamon a while back and Polly maybe recently. But an Israeli investor guy in this clothing manufacturer that they were actually in the Cedars also. They officed a company called Creative Image, and they officed down on Harwood and Richardson in a building there. And I found out that in our initial conversations, which I was a shy kid anyway, I wasn't going to call her and ask her for a date, but her boss was this known real estate investor down in the Cedars. So it took me a while, but you know, we finally went on our first date. I finally called her, and we went on our first date, I think, to the Ambassador Park there on June 3rd of 1984. And But yeah, it was all these sequences of events.
Yeah.
And I remember I kept calling her and asking her out, and I was always a shy one. And I didn't want to say, do you want to go here or do you want to go there? Because I didn't want to say a place that she didn't like in case she would reject me. And she wasn't going to go out with me unless I picked a place. And you know Elaine. I mean, Elaine is pretty tough. And she's like, well, where are we going to go? And I finally picked this place, and she agreed. And you know, I guess kind of the rest is history there. But, you know, we were together for, I guess, probably a year. Broke apart for a while. Because I kind of had a falling out. I didn't know that I was going to fall in love with this girl, but I knew that I couldn't marry someone who wasn't Jewish. And I think I cried. I don't remember if she cried or not, but I cried, and we broke up for a while. And we came back together, and Elaine said that she would consider it. You know, she came from a family in Tennessee that not religious. We started going to classes at Shireth Israel, because at that time I was still a member where my family had been a member since the 1920s. Again, where my great-grandmother Sarah Goodman, Mama Goodman, ran the kitchens there going back in the 40s. And so we had a lot of family there. We started going through classes. Back at that time, Rabbi Weinberg was there as a junior rabbi with Rabbi Offsire. And Elaine liked it, and so she, took a while, and she finished up and converted there at Shireth. Rabbi Weinberg, I'm trying to remember who else officiated and was outside the door when she was in mikvah. Maybe even Jack Malad, and some others were there. But yeah, she did that, and then. We were planning a bigger wedding, and it ended up all kind of falling apart, and we ended up kind of eloping, and we got married in the chapel at Shireth Israel, August 27th, 1986, by Rabbi Weinberg. Thankfully, because of her employer's wife, Pauline Denur, she took a bunch of really professional-like photos of us. And also, we just set up a video camera. So we have a video of us and a very young Rabbi Weinberg singing the Sheva Brachot there at our wedding in 1986.
That's a really special story. Didn't know. Where did y'all live when you first got married? What part of town?
Well, we both had been kind of in the northeastern area anyway. So we lived in an apartment in the Lake Highlands area off of, originally like Odelia and Skillman before, and then very shortly thereafter, almost at the same time we got married, I ended up, I'd been doing, the real estate business obviously wasn't doing well in Dallas in the mid-1980s. I was working some side jobs, restaurant, whatever. I ended up getting the opportunity to go to work for the gentleman who I still work for, almost 38 years later. And I went to work for him, and we subsequently bought a house in 1987, also in Lake Highlands, on a street called Walbrook, over off of a little further east, Kingsley and Odelia. So.
And then I know you have two children.
Right, Melissa and Adam. And we had both of them over there. Both of them went to Temple Emmanuel Preschool, which is a great preschool, and had a great experience there. And then subsequently we decided, first with Melissa, obviously, and then with Adam, to go to Solomon Schechter, now a Levine Academy, which was eventually the genesis for us moving north to our current home on Mulroney in 1997.
Richard, I know, I'm aware of only a couple of things that you've been active with in the community, in the Jewish community, but I want you to share what you have done.
Okay, so I guess almost by accident in 1998, through a meeting, I think I was at an event at Solomon Schechter, and Robert Feinberg was there, Bob Feinberg. And I think his wife Cheryl had been my kid's teacher at Temple Emmanuel. And he said, "Oh, Richard, did you know that there's a group getting together, organizing around Rabbi Weinberg to try to start a new synagogue?" And I guess really prior to that, I hadn't been involved in anything at the synagogue other than going to synagogue at Sheriff, for things. And we'd go with our daughter Melissa to Shabbat services, and she enjoyed those very much. But I remember that they were having a meeting, and at that time, I think the first meeting I went to was at David Stanley's house. At that time, he lived on Campbell, north of Frankfurt. Wasn't married to Nancy yet, I don't believe, but Nancy was there. And there was a group of 20 or 30 people, and, God, Rabbi Weinberg had married us. I loved him, great guy. And they're trying to get this group together to form a congregation. And they did, formed a group called Shomrei Torah. I'm not sure exactly how the whirlwind happened, but I ended up, maybe because I didn't say no, being on the original steering committee for that and the original executive committee to that. On file somewhere, there's the corporate documents for Shomrei Torah, and I'm listed as one of the officers for that. And then obviously it's known that Shomrei Torah ended up merging with Anshai Emet, which was already existing there in Plano. And when the merger took place, I ended up getting on the original executive committee there as treasurer. And despite the fact that I had a finance degree, that was still a bit of a bookkeeping challenge. but the predecessor to that, Carl Uretsky, may he rest in peace, was very helpful in transferring stuff and answering questions. And I did that, I think, for a year, and then I was a vice president, and then I was executive vice president. I chaired the real estate committee. You might recall that we got a piece of land and we were going to do a building on Tradition Trail. And all of the fundraising and everything we did around that was based on the vision of doing it there. And then we ended up transferring in a very traumatic time, switching over and buying the old church building on Parker Road. But so yes, I was original steering committee, treasurer, vice president, executive vice president, and then I was the president just for 1 year, I believe, 2002 or 2003, for 1 year. And it was, although my employer was happy with it, and he liked having an employee who was so involved, and I guess he felt so prominent in the community that it was taking about 50% of my workday to do that. So I only did that for 1 year, and then executive vice president. Subsequent to that, and I can't remember exactly the year, they got me back in, and I was president of the men's club for a year. And that was fun. And I can't remember exactly the timing that I was talking to Karen Garfield, and because I've always been a believer and a purchaser of Israel bonds. My grandfather Katz had been a great believer and proponent of purchasing Israel bonds and was part of the original push back in 1951 when they were founded, and financed a big article in the New York Times and for Israel bonds that I became the local, I guess the Dallas, and I don't know if it's called a chair or whatever, leading Israel bonds, but I did that for a short time. It was different, and I presumably, I guess I could have stayed on longer with that, but it was different than the positions I'd had at Anshe Torah, which were so much more hands-on. And so I stepped down from that, and I think some of the subsequent people who have become involved there with the local Israel bonds have done a fantastic job with that.
Going back a little bit, I know we mentioned your children's,
Yes.
but what are they doing?
Okay. So Melissa followed in Dad's smart footsteps and went to the University of Texas and got her architect's degree, and initially moved to Houston, and then subsequently moved out to the San Francisco area. Lived in San Francisco for a short time, and then subsequently moved to Oakland, where she still currently lives and works for an architecture firm there called Gensler. She started with them in Houston, transferred to Oakland with them, and has been with them ever since. And loves it and works her tail off and is great at that. Adam, he went to University of Arizona, had a great time there, kind of like Dad had at the University of Texas, and came and went to work. He got a marketing degree, went to work for an advertising firm. Really didn't like that very much, but liked marketing and the more digital side of it. He decided to go back and get a master's degree, which he ended up figuring out how to do in Milan, Italy. I guess he didn't have to take exams to get in, and it was a 13-month program, and he liked it that way. But better than that is it gave us an opportunity, Elaine and I, an opportunity to go to northern Italy and visit him while he was there for 13 months and tour around there, which is very nice. But he's back in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He lives in Fort Worth now. Unfortunately, as of today, he had a great job with a big company called Gartner, and very recently they had like a restructuring, and so he's looking right now. So if anybody sees this video and are hiring somebody in digital marketing, Adam's available.
Okay, well.
But neither of them are married, and so no grandkids yet.
Okay, as of the date that we said today was April 2nd.
Yes.
Okay, we're kind of going more to a conclusion of this. By just reviewing what you've discussed, it's been such a wonderful family that you've had. They've done so much for coming to the country, coming to this area, developing it business-wise in the Jewish community, in the business world. There's been so much, and you've contributed to it. You have had wonderful role models to go with and
Yes,
to be connected
absolutely.
with. I don't know if there's anything else that if you want to share. I feel like I can hear in your voice how proud you are of the family that you're part of on both sides, and what you've done. But if there's anything else that you want to share, or you feel like it's come up that you want, it can be things also, the values that you have, anything that's been passed on, something that you would like to share.
Well, I've always been interested in the family history, and particularly the Jewish family history, and I've researched a lot. I have it's all scattered in my brain, and I have piles of papers from Israel family and from all the different grandparents and great-grandparents and how they got here. Very recently, unfortunately, I learned I'd never really known about how my Katz family, which most recently came over from Lithuania, how other than my Zadie, Abe Katz, and his two brothers, one came to the United States and the other one who worked for Jabotinsky, all the rest had been shot and killed by the Lithuanian Nazi sympathizers, rounded up and shot in 1941. But just the connection I have, and I remember my Zadie telling me when he was a teenager and he got on this train leaving Lithuania with his one brother to get away from the pogroms. I mean, obviously all the other family had done the same thing, but I didn't hear the stories because it was a generation earlier, and I'm sure there were similar stories, but I remember his father, my Zadie Katz's father, said, always remember that you're a Jew. And, that was kind of the parting words, and it's always stuck with me. And my Zaidi was a studier of Maimonides. I've read Maimonides, I've read Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot. I really feel the connection to the history, and I hope that my kids, and going forward, feel some of the same thing.
Richard, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeanette.
I appreciate
It's been a
it.
pleasure.